We had a constitutional monarchy, right, for a little bit. Well, we had absolute monarchy, and then creaky, inefficient, crumbling absolute monarchy, and then we got, after 1791, a constitutional monarchy, and then we got a republic and the reign of terror and all the heads being chopped off, choppy. And then at the end of section 2, where we left you last week, they replaced Robespierre's dictatorship with the Directory. Remember, that's a government. It had 5 different presidents, so it would be even more confusing than living in America today. And that government was very inefficient. And for a while, they liked that. An inefficient government, the one good thing about it is it doesn't mess with you. It's too busy with its own self to worry about taking your stuff. And so that's the way the French people wanted it after they got rid of Robespierre. But eventually, an inefficient government doesn't meet the people's needs, and they get mad. So that's what's going to happen. And that's what's going to bring our friend Napoleon to power. All right. Now, Napoleon was born on a little island off the coast between Italy and France called Corsica. And at the time Napoleon was born and grew up, it was controlled by an Italian prince. But then during his life, because of a peace treaty, it starts to be controlled by France. But Napoleon grows up speaking Italian, and he learns French, but he'll always speak French with an Italian accent. So he's an outsider. Okay, Napoleon's going to completely control France, even though he's not French. And we're going to see this pattern again and again. Hitler's not German, he's Austrian. Stalin's not Russian, he's Georgian. These outsiders come in, all right, and are able to assess a society in a different way and represent things to different people. Okay? And so he's from the lower nobility. He has 7 brothers and sisters. So they have noble title, but they're not rich. Okay, so money's tight. And so Napoleon joins the army to have a career and to have sustenance. And he attends military school as a boy. He doesn't do very well. He graduates near the bottom of his class, but he has a natural aptitude for combat and leadership. And it is a great time to be in the military if you don't die, because there's lots of opportunity to move up. All right. Napoleon gets commissioned an officer, a lieutenant, which is where you start with a commission. And he becomes an officer of artillery. That's the big guns, the cannons. And there are nobles, as the wars of the French Revolution go on, there are lots and lots of officers who are killed in battle, and even more who are killed by Robespierre and the Jacobins. And so there's lots of room for promotion. And so Napoleon begins to promote. And also during wartime, you promote pretty fast in the military anyway, if you're good at what you're supposed to be doing. All right, so he gets to be the hero of the hour in several instances, starting with this picture down here at the bottom. All right, so here's Napoleon, and here are the cannon that he commands. Now, he had been called back to Paris to speak at the War College, and the people are dissatisfied with their government. And what do when they're dissatisfied with the government? They riot, right? Look at the March on the Bastille, the March on Versailles, the September massacres, okay? The Great Fear. When the people of France at this time don't get what they want, they take to the streets and break things and start fires and hurt people. And that's what they're going to do in 1795. The difference being Napoleon is there. And Napoleon is assigned a company of artillery there in Paris, and he wheels the cannons out into the street and shoots them into the crowd. All right. And he loads them with what's called grape shot, which essentially turns a Napoleon cannon into a giant shotgun. The individual pellets are about this big. Okay. And so they will tear you apart. And he kills hundreds of these protesters in one single round of shots, and that ends the protest. And so Napoleon is seen as having saved the government, when all the other times when people approach the government collapses. But Napoleon shoots into the crowd, and the crowd decides they don't want any more of that. And so the government's going to reward him, and they make him a brigadier general, and they give him an entire army. And this is very Napoleon, without any orders to do so, he takes his whole army to Italy to attack the Austrians. Why do you go to Italy to fight Austrians? Because northern Italy was controlled by Austria back then. And he whoops on them. Okay, the Austrians get whooped on a lot if you make a study of European warfare. And so he whoops them so bad that they sue for peace. And for a while, France is down to just 2 enemies. And that makes him more popular. And then he gets orders to focus on hurting Britain. And what he's always going to do is try to attack British trade and their empire. And so again, he takes his army out in the field, and this time they go all the way to Egypt. Now, why would you go to Egypt to fight the British? Well, Egypt is between the British and their most important colony of India, which we're going to look at more when we get into imperialism in a few weeks. And Napoleon lands his troops in Egypt, and there he fights the indigenous troops and defeats them and wins military victories on land, not against the British, but against Egyptian Muslim troops, and essentially looks for all the propaganda and things that he's conquered Egypt. And there's great paintings of him at the foot of the pyramids and the Sphinx, and they discover the Rosetta Stone and all this cool stuff. Unfortunately, for Napoleon, while he's there sort of as a tourist in Egypt, the British fleet sails in, and his whole fleet is parked in the port where his troops came from, and they sink the entire French fleet in port. And it's called the Battle of the Nile because it's in the mouth of the Nile. And the French army has no way to get home now. There's no ships left. But Napoleon can get back by himself or with a few people, and he hurries back to France for 2 reasons. Well, maybe for 3. Number 1, the government's about to collapse again, and the government is so weak, Napoleon thinks that he can take over. Because what happens is the government can't survive without the military. He controls the military, therefore he controls the government. Also, he finds out that his wife, Josephine, is cheating on him. And so that's a scandal, and he wants to get back and deal with that. And then he also wants to get back to Egypt before the news of his whole army being lost in the desert gets back. And so he gets back to France, and he still looks like the conqueror of Egypt, the victor over the Austrians, and he's still very popular enough that he's going to just take over the government. All right, and in French, you call it a coup d'état. Coup d'état, strike at the state. All right, it means you just take power because you can. You don't win an election, you don't inherit it, you just take the power. And in November 1799, he carries it out, and he creates what's called a consulate, trying to go back to the way things were during Rome. And Napoleon copies a lot of Roman stuff, and then Mussolini copies a lot of Napoleonic and Roman stuff, and then Hitler copies a lot of Mussolini stuff. So they're all going to have these Roman-looking standards and banners that they go to battle under and stuff, even though they're French and, well, Italian and German. So he takes power, and he rules himself. There's 3 counselors. One of them, you may remember from the French Revolution, Abbé Sieyès becomes one of the first consuls. And Napoleon decides that he's the most important consul or first consul. And with control of France, he begins to make major W's on the battlefield. Okay, he defeats the British, he defeats the Russians, and the Austrians get back in the war only to be defeated again. And so Napoleon is getting dub after dub after dub, and more popular, okay, since illegally taking power. So what does he do? He has a vote, right? And he basically says to the men of France, who likes me? All right. Retroactively, he asked them to approve all the stuff he did by voting, yes, we want you to be not only first consul, but first consul for life. And so he wins a vote, and this gives him the legitimate authority he feels to rule France. And by approving this, they're approving the new constitution for France with what you call a fancy word for a vote is a plebiscite, right? So yesterday we had our national plebiscite, and we'll find out who won, hopefully before you guys graduate. So the people approve of what he did, and so now he's got authentic power. And he continues to do more stuff that makes him popular, right? He sets up a national bank. This is something France had never had. Britain had it, and that means that they can control the value and circulation of their own money, their own currency. And this would have helped them a great deal back in 1789 when they didn't have it and the economy collapsed. So he fixes major problems in the French economy, including tax collection, as well as having a central bank. He establishes a series of lycées, which are government-run public secondary schools. And essentially, Napoleon wants talented men, again, it's very sexist at this time, ladies. He wants talented men to run his administration. He doesn't care. They don't have to be from the upper classes. So you guys would be tested at around the age you are now. You'd get these government tests, and those of you who did well would get to go to these advanced schools, regardless of whether, how rich you were, if you could pay for it. And so he's training young men from all across the social classes of France to be in his administration. So that's popular. All right. And then go all the way back to the Constitution of the Clergy in 1790, right? The French Revolution was at war with the Catholic Church because they viewed it as part of the old regime that had been oppressing the people. But remember, 90% of French people were Catholic. And so this war between the church and France has been very stressful and disruptive for French society. And Napoleon has a sit down with the Pope, Pius the ninth or 11th. It's the X and then the ones on one side or the other. I can't remember. And he signs an agreement, which a fancy word for agreement is a concordat. And he signs a peace treaty basically with the Catholic Church and reestablishes the Catholic Church in France. That makes him very popular. Right? And then part of that constitution is a new set of laws called the Napoleonic Code, or Code Napoleon. And this is a universal set of laws that apply to everybody. Okay, this is one of the things that started the revolution in the first place, right? There were different laws for the first estate, the second estate, and the third estate. Napoleon puts everybody under one law, and people like this too. And so he's so popular, he decides he wants to step up even more. From first consul for life, he wants to be crowned emperor. And one of the reasons he wants to do this is as essentially a tyrant, right? He didn't initially get voted in or inherit his power. He wants some kind of position that he can give to his son. So he has himself crowned emperor, and he has a vote, and the people approve of it. And so he has the Pope come to a ceremony to further stress that they are all good with the Catholic Church. And the Pope, like the Pope did long ago with Charlemagne, the Pope goes to put the crown on Napoleon's head and crown him as the Holy Emperor of France. But Napoleon, being Napoleon, takes the crown from the Pope's hands and puts it on his own head, basically saying, nobody crowns me but me. And then after he crowns himself, he crowns his then wife, Josephine. All right. And he becomes the Emperor of France. And he's going to continue to do popular stuff for a while. Right. But he has to make some tough choices. Now, we talked a little bit about Britain and France and Spain having colonies in the New World. That's more of a middle school type thing. But essentially, the French and the British were fighting for control in North America for a long time. Remember the French and Indian War that we looked at? And the French keep losing to the point where finally Napoleon decides to give up on the New World. The final straw is on the island of what we now call Hispaniola, is the only successful slave revolt in history, where a man named Toussaint Louverture leads the slaves in what we now call Haiti in a revolt against the plantation owners and masters, because slavery was even more brutal there than it was here in the United States. And the slaves, they overtake the masters and the slave-owning class flees. Napoleon sends in an army to try and put it down, and they fail. So he decides, fine, I'm just going to get rid of everything in the Western Hemisphere and focus on Europe. And this is a huge opportunity for the young United States, because if you look, and you'll look at this next year too, we basically were East Coast, and then Ohio, Indiana, all of that was considered the West. That was called the Northwest back then. And what's going to happen is Napoleon's going to sell all the French stuff to Thomas Jefferson in the Louisiana Purchase, and basically the United States doubles in size for only $15 million. We pay $15 million, less than 2 cents an acre for the whole middle third of the country, right? And Napoleon gets some cash to fund his military operations in Europe, and the United States doubles in size. So now he's focused back on Europe, and we get a grand alliance of Britain, Russia, Austria, and Sweden. Now, remember when Louis XIV was such a big deal, all the rest of Europe would band together to fight him. I think I talked about this. Basically, Louis was like Thanos and then all these other nations are like the Avengers, and they fight until they're exhausted, then another one comes in, and they just keep forming new coalitions and fighting against this one huge thing. And that's how they treat Napoleon as well. And so there are all these different coalitions that form, break apart, reform, and Napoleon is beating all of them. He has several brilliant battles. He has really new tactics and new ways to fight that'll become the standard in Europe. But it's going to take a while for the other nations to catch up with him. In fact, Napoleon will be so influential that when World War I starts 100 years later, they're going to initially try to fight it the way Napoleon fought this, but it won't work. Right? And so for a while, he knocks out everybody but Britain, and Britain stands alone. And we're going to see this time and again where all the nations on the continent have either made peace or an alliance with a power, and it's just Britain off the coast there that remains independent. And he wants to end that, just like Hitler's going to want to end it, right? And to do that, he feels he's going to need to invade England. Remember, Philip II tried that with the Spanish Armada. Didn't work. The only one that ever successfully invades England was back in the 11th century with William the Conqueror. And so Napoleon has a whole French-Spanish fleet assembled in the Bay of Biscay between France and Spain in the Atlantic. And there he meets the British fleet and Lord Nelson, the same British admiral who destroyed his fleet in the Nile. And the French fleet loses once again. Lord Nelson dies in the battle and becomes a national hero for the British to this day, unless we keep tearing down statues. But essentially, having lost naval superiority, Napoleon has to give up on militarily invading Britain. And so he thinks back to when he tried to hurt them when he went to Egypt. And if he can't beat them militarily, he's going to try and wage war on them economically. And that's what's going to lead to the downfall of Napoleon's empire. Right? But in 1812, the French Empire is at its height. Okay? Napoleon controls all of Europe, except for Britain, right? Portugal, Sweden, and the Ottomans, the Turks who are down in the Balkans, but all of Central and Western Europe he controls. Right? And countries he directly takes over, he puts his relatives on the throne. Remember, he has 7 brothers and sisters. He puts them on the thrones of these countries, except for one brother who he doesn't like his brother's wife. So instead of putting him on the throne, he gives it to a brother-in-law. But basically, Napoleon has conquered most of Europe and put his family on the thrones, and he runs most of Europe at this time. Right? From 1807 to 1812. Right? And this is the height of Napoleon's power. And then we'll see on Friday, he's going to try and wage economic war against Britain, and that's going to cause the whole thing to fall apart. All right? But today we're only concerned with the empire at its height. So we're going to show you today's project using our friend Cami.